I am so pleased to be spending this evening in this room with so many people who have decided that they cared enough about these issues, about political inequality, about corruption, about making our democracy stronger, that you're willing to come out and spend your Friday evening here learning about this, working with groups that are trying to change things for the better. It's inspirational. Absolutely heartwarming. So thank you, and thank you to the organizers of this event, to our two Dans, and all of the other people. Putting an event like this together is not easy. It requires a huge amount of work and a lot of commitment, and so I applaud them and I applaud all of you. But you don't need to applaud me. All right, so I'm here tonight to talk to you about my work on political inequality in the United States. I want to start by showing you a line. Doesn't look like much, but as Dan indicated, I'd spent about 10 years working, and this line is the most important thing that came out of my 10 years of research on political inequality. This line is so important that it's been called the most unsettling line in American politics. So what is this line? What this line shows you is the amount of influence that average citizens have over what the government in Washington does. It's not the height of that line that matters. It's the slope. To be more specific, what this line shows you is the relationship between the degree to which ordinary citizens, middle-class Americans, favor or oppose a proposed policy change on the horizontal axis, and the likelihood that that change will be adopted by our government on the vertical axis. Okay, so on the left side of this slide, we've got policies that are very unpopular. 10% or 20% of Americans support those policies. They have about a 1 in 3 chance of being adopted. Over on the right side of the slide are very popular policies. 80%, 90% say they favor those policies. But when you take into account the role of other actors, I'll get to that in a second, it matters not a whit what average Americans think. The popular policies and the unpopular policies are equally likely to be adopted. So let me tell you a little bit about where that line, that 10 years spent producing that line, where that line came from. The line came from my analysis of about 2,000 survey questions. These were questions that were asked in the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s about all different areas of government policy, all focused on the federal government. Domestic and foreign policy, economic policy, social policy, anything that government might plausibly do in the political sphere, the questions concerned. So there were questions about things like, should we raise the federal minimum wage to $6.75 an hour? Or should America send troops to fight in Bosnia? People were asked whether they supported or opposed NAFTA, the free trade agreement. They were asked whether they would favor or oppose letting homosexuals serve in the military. All kinds of survey questions asked across those 3 decades. And for each of those questions, I collected information on the preferences of different groups. The percent of middle-class Americans, people at the median income level, who said they favored or opposed each of these proposed policy changes. The percent of high-income Americans who said they favored or opposed each of these proposed changes, and what I call the net interest group alignment, which is simply an index of, among a list of the most important interest groups in Washington, how many of them favored a proposed policy change minus the number that opposed that policy change. So I have measures of the distribution of views, the extent of support or opposition among these 3 key groups that potentially influence the policy decisions that government in Washington makes. And then I also, of course, have information about whether that proposed policy change was adopted. In particular, whether it was adopted within 4 years of the time that the proposal was measured, that the preferences were measured and the proposal was put on the agenda. Now, this was a significant endeavor, right? Collecting this kind of information for about 2,000 survey questions over many periods, many decades of time. But it resulted in a much more comprehensive data set on government policymaking than had previously existed, and it allowed me to measure the influences of these different actors in ways that had not been possible before. What I did with these data was to construct a statistical model, right? A model that would predict whether a policy change, whether a proposed possible change was in fact adopted or not, as a function of, as a consequence of these three different potential influences: the degree to which average citizens favor the policy change, the degree to which economic elites, people at the top of the income distribution, favored that change, and the relative balance of interest groups in Washington. The key point here is that the goal was to statistically disentangle the effect of these different groups, right? So that we could say, for a policy with a given level of support among, say, economic elites and interest groups, how much difference does the degree of support or opposition among average citizens make? Or, similarly, if we wanted to know whether economic elites are an important influence, we would want to say, for a proposed policy change that had a given level of support among average citizens and interest groups, how much difference does it make in the likelihood of that policy being adopted, whether elites are favorable or unfavorable or split in the middle? Now, this is a somewhat condensed and simplified version of the kind of analysis that I did. There's lots of details both on the methodology as well as on the results that you can find in my book, Affluence and Influence, and in the article that's been mentioned, I co-authored with Professor Benjamin Page, which is out just today, I believe, in the September issue of Perspectives on Politics, an academic journal which I don't think you'll find in your local Barnes & Noble, but which you can find online or I guess at the MIT library. I should also mention that there is a list, or there will be a list, I'm not sure if it's there yet, of the sources that I'm using for my talk and other references for more information on political inequality that will be on the symposium's website. All right, so I showed you the results for the influence of average citizens, middle-income citizens, on policy outcomes. But let's look at these other two groups. Here, the world looks very different, right? Here we see a very different pattern where among economic elites and interest groups, the degree of support or opposition to a policy is significantly related, quite strongly related, to the likelihood of that policy being adopted, right? So on the left side of both of these slides, we see that policies that are unpopular among economic elites or among interest groups have a very low probability of being adopted, while those that have significant support, where the number of interest groups in favor far outweigh those in opposition, or where the proportion of elite Americans, high-income Americans, that favor a policy is high, the chances are much greater that that policy will be adopted. Now, as an interesting aside, you'll also note that there's an asymmetry here. Unpopular policies are very unlikely to be adopted, whereas popular policies still have only about a 1 in 2 chance. Right? So even policies that get very strong support from economic elites and from interest groups are only about equally likely to be adopted as not. And that reflects the strong status quo bias, right, that's built in quite purposefully to our structure of government. Right? Our government in Washington was designed to make policy change difficult. And at least in that one very narrow regard, we can say it's functioning very well. Well, the line on the top of this slide, the sort of core finding from the project that I've been describing, I think it's more than just unsettling. It's a deeply disturbing line. And it's a deeply disturbing implication, right? That our society is a democracy in name only. That's not what most Americans think America should be, and maybe it's not even what most Americans think America is. Right? But these graphs depict a society in which the powerful call the shots and the majority of citizens are political bystanders. Well, all right, that doesn't seem very democratic, but so what? I mean, what are the consequences of a government that responds so unequally to the preferences of different citizens? What difference would it make in our society, in our policy, if government was more democratic and more equally responsive? Well, one way to think about this is to think about the most prominent policy changes of the past few decades. And some of those represent not just prominent specific policy choices that were made at particular times, but broad trends that we can trace out more or less consistently over many years. So, for example, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. This was signed under a Republican, the first President Bush. It was ratified under a Democrat, President Clinton. And it was an important high-profile policy change, but it was one that exemplified and represented a decades-long trend toward a free trade regime in this country. Or the Bush tax cuts of the early 2000s, right, that substantially lowered top income tax rates, lowered and temporarily eliminated the estate tax. These were changes that were also consistent with decades of tax reductions, especially for America's highest earners. Or think about the repeal of the Glass-Steagall banking regulations under Clinton, right? A change that many people blame, for, at least in part, for the Great Recession that we're still struggling to revive from. Well, that again represented a decades-long trend toward deregulation, not only of the financial industry, but of corporate America more broadly. What all of these trends, the trends toward free trade, toward lower taxes, toward deregulation, they all have in common at least two things. One is that they've been embraced with varying degrees of enthusiasm at different times by both political parties. And the other is that they are all dramatically more popular and arguably more beneficial to the most well-off Americans than to the middle class or the poor. If I look more broadly across the 2,000 or so questions in my data set, I see three main areas where we consistently find differences between the preferences expressed by the well-to-do and by other Americans. And these are the three areas, or three of the main areas, where we would find the most consistent consequences of the differential responsiveness of our government and the lack of responsiveness toward the middle class and less well-off Americans. And the first area is in, as you might expect, redistributive policies, things like the progressivity of the tax rate. Not surprisingly, well-off Americans are less supportive of taxes on the rich. They prefer a less generous unemployment compensation policies. With regard to government regulation versus the free market, we find not only that affluent Americans are less supportive of government regulation, whether of the financial industry or corporations more generally, but they prefer market-oriented policies more generally. So even in things like education or healthcare, school vouchers, school choice programs, Medicare HMOs, right, the sort of partial privatization of Medicare, these are policies that get much greater support from the well-to-do, and they're arguably also policies that people with more resources, higher incomes, greater education, more information are better able to take advantage of than our less well-off Americans. And the third area is in moral and religious issues. And on these kinds of issues, things like abortion, gay rights, school prayer, and these sorts of issues, we actually see well-off Americans hold more liberal views than do the middle class or the poor. And that brings up an interesting point, which I'll just kind of raise and then leave to the side, which is that a more democratic America would look rather different across a number of different policy domains than what we have now. And many of us would support a lot of those policy changes, but few of us would support all of them. Right? There are things that liberals would like about a more democratic policy regime and things that conservatives would like, for example, on these moral and religious issues as well. Now, what the most important issues are is going to differ from different people, but arguably the redistributive policies, those that either exacerbate or ameliorate the economic inequality that's been increasing in this country for many decades, would certainly be among those. So let's look at a few of the specifics here. On a different study, a survey was taken of wealthy Americans and of the public as a whole, and they were asked identical questions, but on many of those questions responded very differently. So when asked, what's the most important problem facing the country, this was a survey done about 3 years ago or so, almost a third of wealthy Americans said that the deficit was the most important problem, something mentioned by barely a tenth of the public overall. On the other hand, unemployment was hardly on the list at all for America's most wealthy respondents to this survey, whereas about a quarter of the public overall identified unemployment as the most important problem. Maybe not that surprising, right? Unemployment is something that can be quite important, quite consequential for ordinary working Americans, but is not a problem for most of America's wealthy. In fact, if they own businesses, they might even benefit from a high unemployment rate. The other questions they were asked, for example, whether government should see to it that no one is without food, clothing, or shelter. Perhaps a surprisingly high 43% of wealthy Americans agreed with that sentiment, but a much higher 68% of the public as a whole thought that that was government's responsibility. The minimum wage. They were asked whether the minimum wage should be high enough that no family with a full-time worker falls below the poverty line. Only 40% of the wealthy, but about twice that number among the public as a whole, agreed that the minimum wage should be set that high. And if asked whether government should see to it that everyone who wants to work can find a job, 68% of Americans said yes, but only 19% of the wealthy. Clearly, the priorities, right, that are expressed by the public on a survey like this are not the priorities that our government has been pursuing. Not only over the last 5 or 6 years since the beginning of the recession, but over the past 4 or 5 decades. This raises the question of why a system that does such a poor job of responding to the needs and the preferences of the majority of citizens, why that system can persist in a democracy. Right? After all, people can vote. We have elections every couple years for federal offices. Candidates compete quite fiercely, right, for voters' allegiances. So why don't voters simply replace those who aren't responsive to their needs? Well, occasionally that does happen, right? Occasionally we elect politicians who do put front and center the needs and the preferences of ordinary Americans, who do prioritize the values and the interests of the working class. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. Not all candidates are the same. I think that's a really important thing to note. But all candidates, at least all viable candidates for federal office, are the same in at least one regard, and that is they all depend on people with money. Right? You simply cannot run a viable campaign for federal office unless you have access to vast sums of money. It now costs about $1 million to run a successful campaign for the US House of Representatives. And of course, you have to raise that money every 2 years if you want to stay in office. It takes about $10 million to run a successful Senate campaign. And in 2012, the Obama and the Romney campaigns each spent more than $1 billion on their quest for the presidency. Well, that's an awful lot of money. Where does all that money come from? Well, increasingly, it comes from a very small number of very wealthy individuals. This chart shows the proportion of all of the money that's donated in federal races. Right, all of the money given to candidates, to parties, to PACs, to independent spending organizations from 1980 through 2012, the proportion of all that money that comes from 0.01% of the American public. And as you can see, in the 1980s, maybe 10 or 15% of the money that was raised for federal elections came from this teeny sliver of the most generous campaign donors. But that number has increased. And in 2012, over 40% of all the money that was raised for federal elections came from just 0.01% of Americans. 0.01%. That's a very small number. That's 1 out of every 10,000 Americans. You know, we worry when election time rolls around and people see that only 1 out of 2 Americans who are eligible cast a ballot for the president, or only 1 out of every 3 cast a ballot in off years for congressional elections. Well, here we're talking about 1 out of every 10,000, 1/10 of 1/10 of 1%. All right, where does that money go? Well, in recent elections, most of it's gone to Republicans. In 2012, almost 2/3 of the money that came from that small sliver of donors went to Republican candidates and Republican-leaning organizations. But Democrats have also come to rely increasingly on large donors to fund their campaigns, and that's at least as troubling as the reliance of the Republican Party on these big donors. So this chart shows you a different breakdown of the sources of campaign money, in this case between large donors who gave at least $1,500 to a candidate or to a party, and small donors who gave less than that. And what you can see is that in 1980, large donors, and these are adjusted for inflation, so that was $1,500 in 2012, much smaller number in 1980. 1980, the proportion of all the money raised that came from these large donations was only about 20% and was swamped by the money that came from, I wouldn't call them small, but let's call them smaller donations of at least under that amount. By 2012, those numbers had reversed, and the Democrats depended more on large donors than on small donors. In fact, donations of over $1,500 made up the majority of the money that Democrats raised in the last election cycle. What we have now are not one, but 2 parties that are increasingly dependent on these richest Americans to fund their campaigns. Another troubling development in the world of campaign finance is outside spending. So this is money that's spent not by candidates or campaigns, but by third parties in efforts to influence election outcomes. Outside spending crept along at a small amount in the 1990s, increased a bit in the 2000s, a little more in 2008, and shot up in 2012. All right, what happened between 2008 and 2012 that could account for that? Exactly, Citizens United and the development of super PACs. Sources of outside spending in 2012, most of it, the majority, was spent by super PACs. Right, now these are organizations that have to disclose their donors, but can accept contributions in any amount. You can give $1 million, you can give $10 million, you could give $100 million to a super PAC. A smaller sum was spent by sort of regular or traditional PACs, which also disclose their donors, but which have a cap of $5,000 on how much any individual can give. And then we have a substantial amount of money that was given by 501c4 and 501c6 organizations. And these, like super PACs, can accept unlimited donations, but they don't have to disclose who their donors are. Right? This is the so-called dark money in politics. And it tripled in size between 2008 and 2012. And then, I don't know if you can even see it, but up at the top there, that teeny purple sliver, that's the amount that unions spent directly on trying to influence elections. All right, so if super PACs are playing an increasingly large role in funding our elections, where are the super PACs getting their money from? Well, they get them from the super rich. In 2012, 93%, virtually all of the money that super PACs raised came from only 3,318 people, each of whom gave at least $10,000. That's 1/10 of 1/10 of 1/10 of 1%. And the majority of super PAC money, 59%, came from only 159 people. Each of those 159 donated at least $1 million. So what we see is that over time, the sources of campaign spending have become more concentrated from fewer and fewer donors and more affluent donors. Partly as a cause and partly as a consequence of that, the cost of campaigns, of running for federal office, has increased dramatically, and campaigns have shifted their focus toward money-based forms of campaigning, right? Political advertising, so-called paid media, sophisticated targeting out operations. And they rely less on the sort of people power that unions and religious organizations and so on used to, and still to some degree do supply to campaigns. We've also seen over the past decades an increase in lobbying expenditures. Right? We now spend collectively over $3 billion a year by lobbying organizations in Washington trying to influence the federal government. And that's not per election, that's per year. Well, what can we do about that? Well, there's no silver bullet. I think we have to work simultaneously in lots of different areas. Top of the list, though, has to be campaign finance reform. It's a complicated area. There's lots of different work that needs to be done. One thing is to reduce the court-imposed obstacles that currently exist to campaign finance reform by creating an alternative jurisprudence, an alternative understanding of what sorts of constitutional restrictions there are and are not to be on the regulations of campaign spending. Even within existing jurisprudence, we need to do what we can to adopt those kinds of campaign reforms that are possible, including public financing with voluntary limits, which have been adopted by many states and cities, and which politicians at the national level have been pushing for many years. Currently, John Sarbanes has the Government by the People Act, which is one example of this kind of campaign finance reform. We need to demand full disclosure, get rid of dark money in politics, right? And elect politicians who will support and prioritize those reforms. And I think we'll be hearing a lot more about that in a few minutes. Lobbying reform, right? We need to close loopholes in disclosure laws and contribution laws, try to separate out the informational side of lobbying, providing information to Congress, for example, from the contribution side, right? From shifting policy by, well, let's call it bribing elected representatives. We need to stop the revolving door where representatives and their staffs go to work for the same organizations that they had been regulating just a few years before. And we need to bolster the analytic capacity of government, right, so that our representatives aren't reliant on the industries that they regulate for information about policy options and policy consequences. We need to pursue electoral reform, right? We need to make voting easier, not harder. We need to resist voter ID laws that put unnecessary burdens on the least advantaged Americans. And we need to follow the lead of other countries in things like making Election Day a national holiday, or at the very least voting on weekends when people are not at work, automatic registration, and so on. And just as important, we need to strengthen the organizations of civil society, things like unions, which have been in decline in terms of their membership over the past years, but have been critically important in bringing about policy changes of all sorts that are advantageous to ordinary middle-class and working Americans. Citizens groups, people like you, right, organize, push for these kinds of changes. These kinds of reforms that we're talking about, that people here tonight are interested in making happen, they will not be easy. Right? A lot of people benefit from the current arrangements, and they will work hard to keep those arrangements. But change has happened before. It can be done. If we think about the early decades of the 20th century, right, and in the first Gilded Age, the progressive movement, for all of its shortcomings and problems, right, it attacked political corruption, it attacked economic inequality, raised public concerns about these issues, right, with the help of muckraking journalists, and gathered allies, right, among elites, among political elites, among economic elites, among business elites even, people who saw that government was not working and who viewed reform as important. And by doing that, and by creating a mass movement, they were able to bring about very significant changes, right? Direct election of senators, first federal income tax on America's highest earners, women's suffrage, right? Huge expansion in voting rights, primary elections to reduce the power of political machines, and so on. I don't need to tell you that the stakes are high. Our educational system, our economic system, they're under stress. Our infrastructure is crumbling. Our planet is getting warmer. We have new global financial and military powers that we need to deal with. How we respond to these challenges will depend on whose voice government policymakers listen to. If enough people care enough, we can reform our political system, we can break the vicious cycle in which the concentration of economic power and political power reinforce each other and are increasingly concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And if not, well, if not, then we'll have a government that responds only to the interests of the powerful few. And we'll have a democracy in name only. Thank you.